The Big Fat Surprise: Why Butter, Meat and Cheese Belong in a Healthy Diet, by Nina Teicholz. Introduction. Imagine it's the early 1900s. A young anthropologist from Harvard, Wilhelmer Stephenson, decides to do something radical. Instead of just observing the Inuit people of the Canadian Arctic from a distance, he chooses to live with them. To become one of them. For years, he learns to hunt and fish as they do, and he adopts their diet completely. And what a diet it was! For 9 months of the year, they ate almost nothing but caribou. For the other months, it was exclusively salmon, with a brief period of feasting on eggs in the spring. There were virtually no vegetables. Stephenson wrote that the only time the Inuit ate plants was during a famine. And the most shocking part, an estimated 80% of their calories came from fat. The most prized parts of the caribou were the fat deposits behind the eyes and along the jaw. The lean muscle meat, the part we would call a tenderloin steak, was often fed to the dogs. By the standards of his day, this should have been a recipe for disaster. But Stephenson observed something astonishing. The Inuit were the healthiest people he had ever lived with. He saw no obesity, no disease. When he returned to civilization, no one believed him. The stories were considered impossible. So, in 1928, he decided to prove it. In a drastic and daring experiment, he and a colleague checked into Bellevue Hospital in New York City. Under the constant supervision of a team of skeptical scientists, they vowed to eat nothing but meat and fat for 1 full year. The public outcry was immense. Friends warned them they would die. Yet, after a year of consuming fatty steaks, brains fried in bacon fat, and boiled ribs, the results came in. Both men were in perfect health. Stephenson himself would follow this diet for most of his life, remaining active and healthy until he passed away at the age of 82. This story is a paradox. It stands against everything we've been taught about healthy eating for the last 60 years. We've been told to avoid fat, especially the saturated fat found in meat and butter, as if it were poison. We've been handed a food pyramid that places grains and carbohydrates at its base, and pushes fats to the very top, to be used sparingly. But what if that pyramid was built on a lie? What if the fear that has driven our dietary choices for generations was based not on solid science, but on flawed evidence, personal ambition, and a story that was just too convenient to question? That is the journey we're going on today, guided by the remarkable work of investigative journalist Nina Teicholz in her book, The Big Fat Surprise. This isn't just a book about diet. It's a detective story that took Teicholz nearly a decade to uncover, as she pored over thousands of scientific papers and interviewed hundreds of experts to unravel one of the biggest and most consequential scientific mistakes in modern history. By the end of our time together, you will understand the real story of why we fear fat. You'll see how a single, powerfully ambitious scientist launched an idea that took over the world, and how institutions we trust enshrined it as fact before it was ever truly proven. And most importantly, you will see the surprising, liberating truth about why butter, meat, and cheese might just belong back on your plate. This is the story of how we got our diet so wrong, and how we can finally start to make it right. Book summary. Our story begins in a time of fear. In the years after World War II, a terrifying epidemic was sweeping across America. Men in the prime of their lives, at the office, on the golf course, were suddenly collapsing from heart attacks. The disease seemed to come from nowhere, and by 1950, it had become the nation's #1 killer. Doctors were baffled, and the public was desperate for an answer. Into this climate of fear stepped a scientist named Ancel Keys. Keys was a biologist at the University of Minnesota, a man described as brilliant, fiercely independent, and possessing an indomitable will. He was not a man who accepted the status quo. While many doctors believed heart disease was an unavoidable part of aging, Keys believed it could be prevented. He was determined to find the cause, and he set his formidable mind on one primary suspect: cholesterol. Cholesterol, a waxy substance found in our tissues, had been discovered inside the atherosclerotic plaques that clog arteries. This led to a simple, intuitive idea that still echoes today: cholesterol in our food must lead to cholesterol in our blood, which then clogs our arteries like hot grease down a cold drainpipe. It's a powerful image, and it seemed to make perfect sense. But here is the first big surprise: it was Ancel Keys himself who first proved this idea wrong. In his own studies, he fed his volunteers massive amounts of cholesterol, up to 3,000 milligrams a day, the equivalent of more than 15 eggs, and found it had almost no effect on the cholesterol levels in their blood. By 1955, he concluded that dietary cholesterol was a trivial factor and that this point requires no further consideration. Our bodies, it turns out, are smart. When we eat more cholesterol, our liver simply produces less of it, maintaining a natural balance. So, if eating cholesterol wasn't the problem, what was? Keys pivoted. He proposed a new theory, which would become known as the diet heart hypothesis. It wasn't cholesterol in the food, he argued, but the fat in the food, especially saturated fat, that raised cholesterol in the blood and led to heart disease. To prove his point, in 1952, he presented a chart that would change the world. It was a simple graph, plotting fat consumption against heart disease deaths in 6 countries. The result was a perfect, elegant upward curve. Japan, with very little fat in its diet, had very few heart disease deaths. The United States, at the top of the chart, had the highest fat intake and the most deaths. The message was undeniable: eat less fat, and you will save your life. This single chart was the acorn from which the giant oak tree of our modern fear of fat grew. Every piece of advice you've ever heard, to choose skim milk over whole, a lean chicken breast over a steak, margarine over butter, can be traced back to this moment and to the relentless ambition of Ancel Keys. But there was a problem. A big one. At a World Health Organization conference in 1955, a biostatistician named Jacob Urashami stood up and challenged Keys. He pointed out that data on fat intake and heart disease was available for 22 countries, not just the 6 Keys had chosen. What happened when you plotted all 22? The perfect curve vanished. It was replaced by a random Jackson Pollock-like splatter of dots. There was no clear relationship at all. Countries like France and Switzerland had high-fat diets but low rates of heart disease. Keys, it seemed, had cherry-picked his data to fit his hypothesis. For most scientists, this would have been a crushing blow. But Ancel Keys was not most scientists. Humiliated but undeterred, he declared he would prove his critics wrong. He would launch the most ambitious nutrition study in history, the 7-country study. This study would follow nearly 13,000 men in 7 different countries to settle the debate once and for all. Yet, once again, the selection of countries seemed a little too convenient. Keys chose countries like Finland and Japan, which seemed likely to confirm his ideas, while avoiding countries that would challenge them, like France or Switzerland. His colleague later explained that Keys simply had a personal aversion to being in France and Switzerland. When the results came out in 1970, they seemed to be a stunning victory for Keys. The study showed a strong correlation between eating saturated fat and dying from heart disease. The men in Finland, who ate a diet rich in dairy and meat, had sky-high rates of heart disease. The men on the Greek island of Crete, who ate very little, had almost none. The conclusion appeared clear: saturated fat was the killer. This finding became the bedrock of nutritional policy for the next 50 years. But if you look closer, as Nina Teicholz did, the foundation begins to crumble. First, the correlation didn't even hold up within countries. For instance, Men in eastern Finland died at 3 times the rate of men in western Finland, yet their diets were virtually identical. And even more troublingly, when Keys followed up 15 years later, he found that while a low saturated fat diet was associated with fewer deaths from heart disease, it was not associated with a longer life. People on the low-fat diets were just as likely to die. They simply died of other causes. This is a critical point that has been buried for decades. Avoiding fat didn't make people live longer. Then there was the data itself. The study's dietary information for Greece, the country that would become the model for the healthy Mediterranean diet, was based on a shockingly small number of men. And, incredibly, a significant portion of the data was collected during Lent, the 48-day period of religious fasting when Greeks abstained from all animal products, the primary source of saturated fat. This astonishing oversight meant that the saturated fat intake of the healthy Cretans was drastically undercounted. The 7-country study was an epidemiological study, meaning it could only show an association, not prove that one thing caused another. It was possible that something else entirely was responsible for the differences in heart disease. In fact, years later, when an Italian researcher reanalyzed the data, he found that the food category that correlated most strongly with heart disease mortality wasn't saturated fat at all. It was sweets. The idea that sugar, not fat, might be the true culprit was championed at the time by a prominent British scientist named John Yudkin. But Ancel Keys would have none of it. He aggressively attacked Yudkin's theory, calling it a mountain of nonsense and accusing Yudkin and his commercial backers of ignoring the facts. Keys was so convinced he was right that he was unwilling to seriously entertain any other possibility. The story of how this unproven idea became the official dietary advice for the entire world is a lesson in how power, personality, and politics can shape science. It wasn't just Keys. The idea needed powerful institutions to carry it forward. The first, and most important, was the American Heart Association, or AHA. In 1948, the AHA was a small, underfunded group of doctors. Then, something happened that changed everything. Procter & Gamble, the maker of Crisco vegetable shortening, sponsored a radio contest and donated all the proceeds, nearly $2 million, to the AHA. Suddenly, the AHA was a financial powerhouse, launched into national prominence by a company whose fortune was built on vegetable oil, the very product that would replace the animal fats the AHA was about to condemn. In 1961, with Ancel Keys and his ally Jeremiah Stamler now on the Nutrition Committee, the AHA released its first official dietary guidelines. It was Keys's diet heart hypothesis in a nutshell. Americans were told to cut back on saturated fat and cholesterol to prevent heart attacks. This was a monumental victory for Keys. Just 2 weeks later, he was on the cover of Time magazine, hailed as Mr. Cholesterol. The idea was further amplified when President Eisenhower suffered a heart attack in 1955. His personal doctor, Paul Dudley White, a friend and travel companion of Keys, held a press conference and told the entire nation to cut down on saturated fat. Eisenhower himself became obsessed with his cholesterol levels, switching to polyunsaturated margarine and Melba toast for breakfast. The message was spreading like wildfire. Animal fats were out, and a new hero was taking their place. That hero was vegetable oil. Before the early 1900s, vegetable oils like soybean, corn, and cottonseed oil were not considered food. They were industrial products, used to make soaps, candles, and lubricants. The fats in every American kitchen were animal fats: lard, butter, tallow, and suet. But vegetable oils had one huge advantage: they were cheap. The food industry saw an opportunity. Through a chemical process called hydrogenation, they could turn these cheap liquid oils into solid fats that looked and behaved just like lard or butter. This process gave birth to Crisco in 1911 and fueled the rise of margarine. For decades, these products were just cheaper alternatives. But when the AHA officially recommended replacing saturated fats with polyunsaturated vegetable oils in 1961, they were suddenly transformed into health foods. The industry seized the moment. Ads for Mazola corn oil urged consumers to take this ad to your doctor. The rush to get on the polyunsaturated bandwagon, as one trade publication put it, became a stampede. And so, Americans dutifully made the switch. We gave up butter for margarine. We stopped cooking with lard and started using Crisco and Wesson oil. We believed we were protecting our hearts. But we were unknowingly trading a traditional fat that humans had eaten for thousands of years for an industrial product with a host of unknown side effects. The process of hydrogenation, which hardens vegetable oil, creates a new type of artificial fat, trans fats. For most of the 20th century, the health effects of these fats were a mystery, and the industry that produced them worked hard to keep it that way. A handful of scientists, like Fred Kummerow at the University of Illinois, began raising alarms as early as the 1950s. He discovered that these unnatural trans fats were accumulating in human tissues, including the heart and arteries, disrupting normal cell function. But whenever negative findings emerged, the edible oil industry would fund its own studies to produce conflicting results, creating a smokescreen of scientific uncertainty that allowed the ingredient to thrive. Industry chemists like Thomas Applewhite, who called himself the ringleader on trans, would attend scientific conferences and aggressively challenge any researcher who presented critical data, effectively intimidating scientists and shutting down debate. Kummerow found himself ostracized from the AHA after he tried to include a warning about hydrogenated oils in their guidelines. The pamphlets were printed, but after the industry lobby objected, the entire batch of 150,000 was destroyed and reprinted without the warning. The drive to get saturated fat out of the American diet only intensified the problem. In the 1980s, a powerful consumer group called the Center for Science in the Public Interest (CSPI), believing saturated fat was the enemy, launched a saturated fat attack campaign. They successfully pressured McDonald's and other fast food chains to stop frying their French fries in beef tallow and switch to partially hydrogenated vegetable oil, that is, trans fats. At the same time, the American Soybean Association, fearing competition from cheaper palm and coconut oils, which are high in saturated fat, launched a massive, racially tinged smear campaign, calling them tree lard and portraying them as a poison being pushed by a surly-looking tropical fat cat. Shamed by this campaign and by full-page ads from a millionaire activist named Phil Sokoloff, food companies like Nabisco and General Mills reformulated thousands of products, replacing stable tropical oils with unstable, trans fat-laden hydrogenated oils. The result was a disaster for public health. By the late 1980s, trans fats were in nearly everything: cookies, crackers, chips, frozen foods, and made up a staggering 8% of all calories consumed by Americans. The effort to eliminate one supposed evil, saturated fat, had led the entire nation to embrace something far worse. The tide only began to turn in 1990, when two Dutch researchers, Martijn Catan and Ronald Mensink, published a landmark study. They showed that trans fats didn't just raise the bad LDL cholesterol, they also lowered the good HDL cholesterol, a double blow to cardiovascular health. This finding was confirmed in a major study at the USDA, ironically funded by the very industry that hoped to disprove it. But the real earthquake came in 1994, when Harvard epidemiologist Walter Willett published an explosive calculation based on his massive nurses' health study. He estimated that trans fats were causing 30,000 deaths from heart disease in America every year. His announcement that eating just 4 teaspoons of margarine a day increased a woman's risk of heart disease by 50% made headlines around the world and created a panic in the food industry. The fall of trans fats had begun. But this leads to the next critical question: what would replace them? And would it be any better? As food companies scrambled to remove trans fats ahead of a 2006 FDA labeling mandate, they faced a fundamental problem. They couldn't go back to using saturated fats like butter or lard, because after decades of anti-fat messaging, consumers were terrified of them. So they needed a new solution. The answer, once again, was liquid vegetable oils, soybean, corn, canola, and safflower oil. These oils, which had always been promoted as heart-healthy in their liquid form, now flooded the food supply as the primary fat used for frying in restaurants and cafeterias across the country. But here lies another, perhaps even bigger, surprise. These oils come with their own serious, and largely hidden, dangers. These oils are polyunsaturated, which means their chemical structure is unstable. When heated, they oxidize and break down into toxic compounds, including aldehydes, one of which is formaldehyde, the chemical used to preserve dead bodies. One scientist described the gunk that builds up in restaurant fryers from these oils as a sticky, horrible witch's brew. The International Agency for Research on Cancer has classified emissions from frying these oils as probably carcinogenic to humans. And this doesn't even account for the toxic compounds that get absorbed into the food itself. Even at room temperature, these oils present a problem. They are overwhelmingly high in a type of fat called omega-6. While our bodies need a balance of omega-6 and omega-3 fats found in fish, the tsunami of vegetable oils in our diet has thrown that balance completely out of whack. This excess of omega-6 is now believed to promote the kind of inflammation that is a key driver of heart disease. So, the 60-year war against saturated fat has led us down a perilous path, first to artificial trans fats, and now to unstable, potentially toxic vegetable oils. We jumped from the frying pan into the fire, and then into another fire. Throughout this whole saga, there has been an alternative story, a parallel universe of research that was dismissed, ignored, and ridiculed for decades. This is the story that suggests the true dietary villain was never fat at all. It was carbohydrates. This idea wasn't new. In 1863, an English undertaker named William Banting published a pamphlet describing how he cured his obesity and numerous health problems by giving up bread, sugar, beer, and potatoes, and eating meat, fish, and game instead. His high-fat, low-carbohydrate approach became a sensation. Throughout the early 20th century, doctors like Blake Donaldson treated thousands of patients successfully with an all-meat, high-fat diet, observing that it not only caused weight loss but also seemed to resolve heart disease, diabetes, and high blood pressure. These doctors were rediscovering an old truth, that obesity isn't a problem of calories, but of hormones. The key hormone is insulin. Your body releases insulin primarily in response to eating carbohydrates. Insulin's job is to shuttle glucose from your blood into your cells for energy, but it also has another critical function. It tells your fat cells to store fat and, crucially, to stop releasing it to be burned for fuel. When you eat a diet high in carbohydrates, bread, pasta, cereal, sugar, your insulin levels stay constantly elevated. Your fat cells are in permanent storage mode. They hoard fat, refusing to let it go, while the rest of your body is starved for energy, making you feel hungry and tired. Dietary fat, on the other hand, has a minimal effect on insulin. When you replace carbohydrates with fat, your insulin levels drop. Your fat cells can finally unlock their doors and release their stored energy to be burned. You lose weight not because you're eating fewer calories, often people on high-fat diets eat more, but because your body's hormonal signals have been corrected. This was the science that drive Robert Atkins championed in his revolutionary books, Turning the Food Pyramid on its Head. He was relentlessly attacked by the nutrition establishment, who were horrified by his promotion of steak, eggs, and butter. But in the early 2000s, a new generation of researchers, tired of the failures of the low-fat dogma, finally began to put the Atkins diet to the test in rigorous, controlled clinical trials. The results were stunning. Time and time again, in head-to-head comparisons, the high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet proved superior to the official low-fat diet recommended by the AHA. People on the Atkins diet lost more weight, and more of that weight was body fat. But it wasn't just about weight loss. Their markers for heart disease risk improved dramatically. Their good HDL cholesterol went up, their triglycerides plummeted, and their blood pressure dropped. Then came the final piece of the puzzle, a discovery that would completely dismantle the case against saturated fat. The scientist behind it was Ronald Krauss, one of the nutrition world's most respected researchers. Krauss discovered that the bad LDL cholesterol isn't one single thing. It comes in different sizes. There are large, light, fluffy LDL particles, which are mostly harmless. And there are small, dense, heavy particles, which are the ones strongly linked to heart disease. So, the crucial question became, what kind of LDL does saturated fat raise? Krauss's research provided the answer. Eating saturated fat primarily increases the large, fluffy, harmless type of LDL. Carbohydrates, on the other hand, do the opposite. They lower the good, large LDL and increase the dangerous, small, dense LDL. This was the final nail in the coffin for the diet heart hypothesis. The very biomarker that had been used for 50 years to condemn saturated fat, its effect on LDL, was now shown, when measured correctly, to be mostly benign. In fact, combined with saturated fat's unique ability to raise the good HDL cholesterol, a strong case could be made that it was actually beneficial for heart health. In 2010, after a painstaking, 3-year review of all the available evidence, Krauss and his colleagues published a landmark analysis. Their conclusion was blunt: saturated fat was not associated with an increased risk for heart disease. Every plank in the scientific case against saturated fat had crumbled. And so we find ourselves at the end of a 60-year journey, having come full circle. We are left with the stunning realization that the official advice we followed has not only failed to make us healthier but may have been the very cause of the epidemics of obesity and diabetes that plague our society. The foods we were told to fear, the rich, satisfying, traditional foods of our ancestors, are the very ones that might hold the key to our health. The big fat surprise is that the villain was the hero all along. Commentary. When you step back and look at the story Nina Teicholz tells, it's about so much more than just food. It's a powerful, and at times unsettling, look at how science works in the real world. We like to think of science as a pure, objective search for truth. But this story shows us that science is a human endeavor, driven by people with ambitions, biases, and the very human need to be right. Ancel Keys wasn't a villain. He was a brilliant and passionate scientist who genuinely believed he had found the answer to a terrifying epidemic. But his passion became a kind of blindness. He saw the evidence that fit his theory and dismissed the evidence that didn't. And once his idea was embraced by powerful institutions like the American Heart Association and the U.S. government, it took on a life of its own. It became dogma, a belief system that was nearly impossible to question without being labeled a heretic. The most powerful lesson in this book, I think, is a lesson in humility. It teaches us to be skeptical of conventional wisdom, especially when that wisdom demands that we abandon the traditions of our ancestors. For thousands of years, human cultures around the world thrived on diets rich in animal foods. We ate the whole animal, prized the fat, and suffered from none of the chronic diseases that overwhelm us today. To believe that a handful of scientists in the mid-20th century suddenly discovered a truth that had eluded all of humanity for its entire existence requires a certain kind of arrogance. This book gives us permission to trust that history and to trust our own bodies. Fat is the soul of flavor. It provides satiety, that deep feeling of satisfaction after a meal. It's a vital source of energy and essential for absorbing vitamins. Denying ourselves this crucial nutrient, it turns out, has been a mistake of historic proportions. So, what can we do with this knowledge? How do we start to apply these lessons in our own lives, right now? It can feel overwhelming, but it doesn't have to be. Here are a few simple places to start. First, let go of the fear of fat. Start by reintroducing whole, unprocessed fats into your kitchen. Choose whole milk instead of skim. Use real butter instead of margarine. Cook your eggs in it. Don't be afraid to eat the skin on your chicken or the fat on your steak. These aren't just indulgences, they are nutrient-dense foods that your body needs. Second, become a critical consumer of health advice, especially when it comes to industrial products. Be wary of anything labeled low-fat, because you now know that when fat is removed, it's almost always replaced with carbohydrates and sugar. Be equally skeptical of industrial seed oils like soybean, corn, and canola oil, which are unstable and may have hidden health risks. Stick to stable, traditional fats like butter, animal fats, and olive oil. And third, and perhaps most importantly, shift your focus from cutting fat to cutting refined carbohydrates and sugar. As the science now strongly suggests, these are the more likely culprits behind our modern health crises. If you simply make an effort to reduce the sugar, white flour, and processed grains in your diet, you will naturally create more room for healthy fats and proteins, and you will be taking the single most powerful step you can toward better health. That was a summary of The Big Fat Surprise by Nina Teicholz. We've explored the main path of her investigation today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary can only ever be a map. The real treasure is found when you walk the territory yourself. The true power of this book lies in the details, the fascinating stories of the scientists, the deep dive into the studies, the shocking quotes from forgotten documents. This summary is your starting point, a way to see if this journey is one you want to take. If anything we've talked about has sparked your curiosity or challenged what you thought you knew, I encourage you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning facts, it's an experience that can fundamentally change your relationship with food and your own health. You can find a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found this summary valuable, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. That way, you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book. Let's continue this journey of learning and growing together.